Have you ever been worried by the fact that your baby wasn't feeding according to the patterns that were prescribed to you by well-meaning providers at the hospital or at your pediatrician's office or even by an IBCLC? I have found that in my practice, this has worried so many families. So today, I would like to discuss the difference between a prescription of how your baby should be feeding and guidelines that are set there to help us understand what are typical patterns in a baby, but how you can set your mind at ease when your baby isn't following those typical patterns. So let's get into it. When I began breastfeeding, I was blindsided by how difficult it was. Having known only a handful of people who had ever done it and only seeing it up close a couple of times, I had a huge learning curve. Since then, I've become a doula, a childbirth educator, and an internationally board-certified lactation consultant, or an IBCLC. I'm your host, NIgrosh, and I welcome you to the Milk Making Minutes, where we explore the systemic, medical, and cultural barriers that make feeding our babies so difficult, so that you know your baby feeding struggles are not your fault, and your triumphs really are the miracles you feel they are. When parents have a new baby, they are told very specific instructions about frequency and duration of breastfeeding. And it can really throw off that family when their baby is hungry more frequently or less frequently than those prescribed times. The numbers we typically hear are that you should feed your baby every 2 to 3 hours, and you should nurse 10 to 15 minutes on one side and 10 to 15 minutes on the other side. But the reality is that is not what all babies do. So how did we get here? We got here through averages. When we decided that we were going to try to increase the rates of breastfeeding after they declined so steadily for nearly a century, for decades at least, and we knew that exclusive breastfeeding for at least the first 6 months led to increased infant health outcomes, decreased infant mortality, fewer rates of infant diarrhea, better infant respiratory outcomes, and a whole slew of other positive health outcomes for both the feeding parent and the baby. The World Health Organization and many other governmental bodies started to create policies and educational campaigns to try to increase breastfeeding rates. And a part of that was creating guidelines to help families understand typical patterns, because one of the barriers to breastfeeding is that many of us have not grown up watching babies breastfeed. And so we don't know what is typical because we haven't been watching it our whole lives. And the guidelines that we are typically given are based off of studies that were done, that were collected over long periods of time, that took averages. Infants would be observed, parents would be interviewed, and they would say in a 24-hour period, how frequently does your baby nurse? And then they would take those answers and they would divide them by 24 hours. And they would say, okay, so exclusively fed babies are nursing 8 times in a 24-hour period. So that means that they should be feeding no less frequently than every 3 hours. And then the same questions were asked and the same infants were observed about their duration of feeding. So are they feeding on one breast? Are they feeding off of both breasts? And most frequently, the babies were feeding off of both breasts. That was the advice given. Make sure to feed off of both breasts. And we know that is really good for milk supply, to remove milk from both breasts so that your body gets the signal to make more milk, because that's part of that autocrine hormonal system of creating milk from the breast to the pituitary gland. And so most often babies would want both sides. And then on average, most infants would be feeding 10 to 15 minutes on each side. And so, 30-minute breastfeeding sessions. Let's make sure your baby is eating that much. What happens when your baby does not match the average? What happens when your baby, instead of feeding 8 to 12 times in a 24-hour period, feeds 15 times in a 24-hour period? Because your baby is not an average. Your baby is an individual. What happens when you produce a lot of milk and you have a very strong letdown, and your baby is able to nurse for 7 minutes and get as much milk in a 7-minute feeding as other babies get in a 20-minute feeding? You start to worry because you've been given these numbers that you feel are prescriptive instead of descriptive. I always like to tell my families that the most important thing is that you are looking at all the factors of health in your baby. So, yes, is your baby gaining weight appropriately? And some babies gain weight a little faster. Some babies gain weight a little slower. But are they gaining weight at their rate? So if your baby is on the lower end of the curve, but they continue to gain weight at the rate that they typically have gained weight, which is going to be hard to know at the very beginning if that's true. But over time, you'll start to realize what their pattern is. Then great. Does your baby have the right number of pees and poops in a day? Great. Does your baby's skin tone look good? Do they have alert moments in the day? Are they meeting their milestones at around the right time? Which, of course, those are averages as well. But if we spend more time tuning in to our babies and getting to know them as individuals, and less time worrying about the clock and these prescriptive time frames, then there is that element of anxiety that gets taken away. I am so pleased to announce my new partnership with Feast and Fettle, which is a locally prepared home delivery meal service. When I ordered from Feast and Fettle, I was able to select from a list of delicious meal options that got delivered to my front door for the entire week. Some of the options that I chose were some zucchini lasagna, some challah bread, some roasted carrots, some pork fried rice, and everything that we ordered, we devoured. It was really so delicious, and all we had to do was heat and serve it. I highly recommend this service as a way to get just one more thing off your plate so that you can spend more time focusing on your family and less time worrying about all the things you have to do, which we know is really good for your milk supply. If you would like to order from Feast and Fettle and just try it out, you can go to feastandfettle.com and use my code MILK, milk, to get $30 off your first week and let Feast and Fettle do the cooking for you. If you want to have less anxiety and more confidence so that your parenting journey can feel like you always wanted it to feel, then go to my website right now so that you can have a person by your side who not only knows how you feel, but who combines my expertise of lactation with your expertise of your body and your baby to help you make the next right step in your lactation journey, because that's all you really need to do is make the next right step. And right now, that next right step is going to my website, www.quavinbirthservices.com. And I can't wait to see your name pop up in my inbox or on my phone, on my text messages. Talk to you soon. There are a couple of things to keep in mind, like in the very beginning, when a baby is brand new, we do want to make sure that we're not passing that 3-hour mark between feedings, that we're offering the breast and allowing them the opportunity to get some amount of milk every 3 hours or so until about the 2-week mark and they have surpassed their birth weight. Once they've surpassed their birth weight, if they go longer stretches between feedings, great. They might be somebody who takes in a lot of milk at once and then they kind of stretch those feedings out, and you might have a larger storage capacity. So they might take in more milk in one setting and feed less frequently. Or they might be a baby who takes in less milk more frequently, and so they're going to have more feeds in a 24-hour period. And so tuning into your baby and figuring out what their patterns are is going to be what serves you more than tracking how long each feed is and if they're lining up with the averages, because your baby is not an average. Your baby is an individual. And keeping that in mind will help keep you sane, because your baby is never going to be an average for the rest of their life. Your baby is always going to be an individual as they grow and meet milestones on their own timeline, whether that's learning to walk or learning to read or learning to climb a tree. They are going to do that on their own timeline based on their own interests and the things that they are into. And that includes breastfeeding and their capacity to feed themselves from your body. One other note about this is if you are worried about weight gain, about milk transfer, then that is the time to see an IBCLC, because sometimes you are tuning into your baby, you are trying to follow their lead, but there could be something that is interfering with milk transfer and you're both struggling to figure it out, even though you were doing your best to tune into your baby and to follow their lead. Make sure that you follow your gut if you feel like, you know what, something really isn't going right here and I need to seek out somebody else for the help that I need. And a good IBCLC will recognize if something is going on beyond their scope and will connect you with other providers who can help you as well. And then the other thing to keep in mind with this is recognizing your baby's cues and being able to feed them on demand means that there could be things that interfere with being able to recognize your baby's cues, like pacifier use, for instance. So if you are somebody who uses a pacifier, that I totally get it, because sometimes we can't always offer the breast right away all the time. And sometimes when babies are sucking, when their urge to suck is being satisfied by something outside of the breast, they will spread out their feeds and have fewer feeds in a 24-hour period, and that can start to interfere with their weight gain. That is one of the reasons why pacifier use is discouraged for breastfed babies. And so making sure that if you are going to use a tool like a pacifier, that you're really tuning into hunger cues and offering the breast first at the first signs of hunger cues, and using that pacifier as an additional tool to calm baby once baby has been satisfied. Because, like I said, your baby might be somebody who needs to feed every hour or every hour and a half. And so if you keep that average in your brain of, oh, it's only been an hour, so he shouldn't need to eat, even though he's showing a hunger cue, and you offer a pacifier instead, that could impact your milk supply and impact the baby's weight gain. And then it could be that tool of the pacifier that's getting in your way, or those numbers, those averages, that is getting in your way of tuning into your baby's cues. So keeping that sort of thing in mind as well, that sometimes those numbers are in our brain. And so then we turn to another tool instead of offering the breast to see if they will take the milk from our bodies. And that can contribute positively to their health outcomes and to your milk supply. So your baby is an individual. Your body is different from other people's bodies. So your storage capacity is different, and your milk supply is going to regulate differently than other people's. And so keeping in mind that the best way to ensure that you have the milk supply you need and that your baby has enough milk is to tune into them as an individual and recognize that the numbers that you are given on how frequently to feed your baby and how long to feed your baby are descriptive of averages and not prescriptive of what you need to do with your baby. If you can keep that in mind, you'll be off to a really great start with your baby. And with that, if you have a baby that feeds really frequently, or if you're exhausted from all the feeding you're doing, even if your baby is on the lower end of things when it comes to feeding, I highly recommend that you try Feast and Fettle to meet your family's meal needs for dinner time. You get meals delivered right to your front door, and they are so good. You can choose the ones you want, so you always have meals that are ones that your family will eat. feastandfettle.com, and you get $30 off your first week by using my code MILK. And if you would like to talk about how your baby compares to other babies in my Milk Making Minutes community, as far as whether your baby feeds closer to the averages for duration and frequency of feeds, then hop into the group, Milk Making Minutes community group on Facebook, and we can discuss it. Thanks. Bye.